everyone, it's Emily, and before you ask, no, I am not a ghost. The light outside is just extremely bright. And so I'm here with my friend Norman to talk about what I read this October. I've actually read quite a few books, so this is going to be very off the cuff, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, first up, Rebecca. So for those of you that don't know what Rebecca is, it's a retelling of Jane Eyre, except it takes place in like the early 20th century, and it's basically this woman, she helps this old lady, they live in a hotel, and then she meets this older gentleman who lives at Manderley, and basically to get away from the life of nannying older people, she marries him, but then there are all these dark secrets she doesn't know, and I gotta be honest, so this is a very well written book and I enjoyed it a lot. I love that whole gothic aesthetic. But Maxim, the dude in this, the main lady doesn't have a name. I didn't really care for him, and I think this is an issue I have with a lot of Jane Eyre retellings. Is like, so when I was in high school, I thought, Jane Eyre and Rochester, it's like, oh, he's so hot and dark and brooding, Byronic, and now I'm just like, Mr. Rochester's kind of a dick. Like the whole putting your mentally ill wife in an attic and that whole thing, I'm like, I don't really sympathize with that. So when it came time, I don't want to spoil everything for the reveal of like Maxim's dark past, and you're supposed to like sympathize with him, and the main character is like, oh my god, he did love me all along. I'm like, given what's revealed about him, I don't think that's like the most pressing thing to be worried about, whether he's loved you or not. But overall, I would recommend this book, especially if you're a fan of Jane Eyre. Okay, so up next is Anna Dressed in Blood. This is a young adult horror book, and it's basically about this main character whose name oh Jesus Christ, Cass. Yep, that's his name. You can see, I don't want to feel like, oh, this book left no impression on me, but I've just read so many books. Anyway, Cass, he's basically Dean Winchester. If you watch Supernatural, he's Dean Winchester. He's this sort of sarcastic teenager who hunts ghosts. And then there's a particular ghost, Anna Dressed in Blood, who he wants to kill, and meanwhile he's trying to discover who essentially ate his dad, which that's a whole thing, and basically becomes kind of a love story between him and this ghost, Anna. And, I mean, this book was okay. Like, I don't want to be like, I was absolutely not interested at all. It just sort of dragged for me. But it might not drag for other people. I think I just had a hard time getting into it because, especially with the character of Anna, and I don't know, some of the ways, like, female characters are, like, displayed in this book had me a little iffy, but Anna, I thought she was very interesting. There's, like, these comparisons of her being, like, Persephone, and she's, like, this dark goddess kind of character, she's just a ghost. But when she became more like normal girl is when I kind of lost interest, and I wasn't really into the whole relationship aspect, which I think really brought it down. But overall, I don't really have any other thoughts. I did find the narrative very funny. It's very blunt, that sort of thing. Like I said, Dean Winchester from Supernatural, so if you think that's the kind of like narrator I would want to read, then I would recommend it. And also, this may sound weird, but like I'm not opposed to male narrators, but I think I'm so used to reading female narrators, and I tend to prefer like female-oriented stories, that maybe this just wasn't my thing, but it might be others. Next we have The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. It's not The House on Haunted Hill, and it's also not The Haunting of House Hill, which I have said more than once, more times than I'd like to admit. So I started reading this because of the Netflix adaptation. Well, actually, I had already read it like a really long time ago, but I remembered absolutely nothing about it except that it was kind of this creepy gothic ghost story, which I enjoyed. And in general, I really like Shirley Jackson, so I decided to revisit this so I could also watch the show. Little did I know that the show is actually very different. It's not like a straight-up adaptation, but it's still really good, also incredibly traumatizing. So the actual book is about these four people. There's a doctor, Eleanor, Luke, and Theo, and they all go into this haunted house to kind of see, okay, what's going on with it, and things go from there. And It's very brief read, but honestly, if you're into gothic atmosphere, this book is amazing. It's incredible. The things Shirley Jackson can do with words, it just makes me incredibly envious. And the characters are actually really interesting, and that was something I didn't expect to really remember, is that the character interactions, especially I think between Eleanor and Theo, which honestly I detected this very strong lesbian subtext, which other people might not, but I definitely detected that kind of vibe, and their sort of relationship and sort of bond these four people create while they're in this house was really compelling to me. So I would definitely recommend this book, and I would also recommend the TV series if you like crying. St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves. This is a collection of short stories. You might know Karen Russell, that's the author. I haven't been really saying most of the authors' names, which is bad, but you know, whatever, off the cuff, etc. Anyway, Karen Russell, you might know her. She did Vampires in the Lemon Grove, I believe, and also Swaplandia. And that the first short story in this thing, Ava Wrestles Alligator, is basically a precursor to that story. And anyway, like, this is as I probably said like 5 times, this is a collection of short stories, and the thing about Karen Russell, she has a very, I don't know how to describe it other than very weird, very surreal look at things, and I'm going to be honest, this collection was okay. I love a lot of what she does with language, and a lot of the imagery is very beautiful, but it's so, like, it's magical realism, and I like magical realism, but there's some distance between the characters, like, well, between the reader and the characters, so like it seemed like it was like trying to be so weird and out there that I couldn't really feel grounded and invested in any of the conflict. Out of I don't recall how many, I think there's about 10 stories in here, I really hooked on to 3 of them. So there's Ava Wrestles the Alligator, which is the story about these 2 sisters, and one of them is basically possessed, and I thought that was interesting. Then there's Out to Sea, which is about this older man who he has this juvenile delinquent who's coming to visit him, and you know, he's very lonely, and they have this connection that builds up that's strange, but it also creates like this emotional intensity of the whole thing, and I actually really cared. And then the story that's like the actual title of the book, St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves, which is about these girls who are they're werewolves, and they're sent to this nunnery to become reformed, to become more human, and sort of like the bond between the werewolves and what I was talking about, like becoming civilized and society and all that. I thought that was really meaningful, and I felt like connected to all the different characters, and they felt distinct. So there are, for me, 3 very strong stories, and I mean, there might be others that I just didn't connect with, but another thing is that after a while, the narrators are kind of like these precocious, mostly male characters, and I mean, that's fine, but they all started to sound the same. It's basically like the narrators sound the same, and it's all just kind of like, oh, this is weird and quirky, and I don't know, it didn't really work for me. But that being said, I would be interested in reading more Karen Russell's work, and I think she shows a lot of promise. So if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, check it out. The Girl from the Well by Rin Chupeco. Okay, this is probably one of my favorite reads. I think my favorite is probably A Head Full of Ghosts, but this one is right up there, and it's basically about the spirit, and there's a lot of Japanese influence, there's a lot of Japanese horror in this, and it's a spirit named Okiku, and it's the story that inspired The Ring, and it's this girl who died in a well, and she's an angry spirit, and she avenges dead children, and she kills people who kill dead children. Well, they don't kill the dead children, they kill the children, and hence they're dead, and she essentially kills the murderers, and then the kids can go free. And meanwhile, like, she doesn't really like getting involved with humans, but eventually she sees this kid named Tark, who teenage kid, very troubled. He has like these strange tattoos on his arm, and he's essentially being haunted by a ghost, and so all these events sort of spiral, and it actually reminds me of Anna Dressing Blood a bit, and even though there's not really, I don't quite remember like a very explicit romantic element with Okiku and Tark. I mean, it's there. I mean, I don't think it's explicit as Anna Dressed in Blood, but I don't know, like, the character relations in this book are very strong, and the language, like, the author does this thing where it's almost like this very poetic technique to kind of, like, show how the characters are thinking and this kind of stream of consciousness, especially with Okiku, to show how her voice doesn't really sound like others, and it's just really well done. And like the setting, all of the settings, especially when we get to Japan, are just very well done and create this like amazing atmosphere. And I would definitely recommend this if you want to read like a really good young adult horror book with amazing characters, and overall it's just a really cool ghost story. A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. Okay, this was probably my favorite of all the ones I read, as I've previously previously mentioned. So it's basically about, it kind of seems like this kind of standard exorcism story. It's about this family, and there are these sisters. There's a mom, a dad, and two sisters, and the younger sister is the narrator, and she's an adult now, and her older sister is dead, and this older sister is basically talking to this author and telling her own story. And basically her family was on this reality TV show about ghosts, and it was about her sister being possessed, essentially a head full of ghosts. Like, she has all these voices in her mind, and it kind of does that whole, is it supernatural, is it not, is it just that the voices are like another like natural cause. And what this book does, I think it does so well, is whereas a lot of stories, I'm thinking of like, I can't remember the name of it, I think it was like The Exorcism of Emily Rose and what have you, all these stories try to do this like, is it supernatural or is it not, when they do the whole exorcism thing, and most of them lean heavily toward, even, I think The Exorcism of Emily Rose is based on like a real event, even that one they kind of lean heavily toward, yeah, it's supernatural, it's not mental illness or whatever. But what made this story so good is that by the end of it, I was just, not only do I not know, but there are certain sort of like different versions of the story, and wondering about the character's motives, and when the character made this character do this, and I can't like say what happened without major spoilers. I was like, did they, like, were there sinister intentions? Was this character like, well, meaning all along? And it just did this narrative ambiguity that I think a lot of stories try to go for so well, and it was just so masterfully done. I can't recommend this book enough. In fact, I want to talk about some more, but I don't want to spoil it, so definitely highly recommend it if you want a spooky read. Yeah, go check it out. The Croning by Laird Barron. Okay, so here's the thing. Out of everything I read, there wasn't a single thing I hated. I think this was probably my least favorite book, though, even though I've heard great things about Laird Barron. I think he's a great writer, and I wouldn't write him off. And I think the best thing about this book is the language, and I'm actually going to read something from it, if I don't mess up again. This is a second take. Without being aware of moving, Don stood 15 or so feet from the ziggurat, Rourke at his side to steady and direct him. Wolverton remained behind, encircled by a ring of torches that spontaneously burst into flame and revealed more of the cavern. The vault of the ceiling raised still higher than the illumination. Ancient runes and alien carvings decorated the rough walls, which were glaciated from eons of water drip and pierced by vermiculate openings. Some of the holes were sufficiently large to admit a small animal, others were fully cave entrances. Dawn recalled Ord Becker's comment, "There's a honeycomb under this mountain." Except, the honeycomb extended farther than under Mystery Mountain, didn't it? This suspicion was confirmed as the blackness of the ziggurat's hull glinted with specks of light, phosphorescent gases, and clouds of nebulae dust, and his breath billowed forth like frost. That word I stumbled over was supposed to be nebula. The image rippled, and the stars vanished, and the veil parted with the soft, wet noise of a live birth. Black yolk sloshed in a minor flood down the foot of the ziggurat, where it pulled and stank of offal and innards gone rank in heat. Gazing into the dripping hole was akin to gazing through a reverse telescope. Something large obstructed the throat of the tunnel between stars. A great squat pillar, the dimensions of an apartment building, or an aircraft conning tower that quaked and quivered as only living flesh may do. So the descriptions, especially the horror, is extremely well done, but so I think the big issue I had is that the main character is not very interesting. He's like a middle-aged professor type, and I think what was very jarring for me is that the story starts off and it has like this fairy tale-esque vibe, and then there's like, dear God, it's like the character that starts off is like this misogynistic character called the Spy, and it's like, oh, he was finger banging scullery maids, and then like language goes from very fairy tale to very kind of like crass essentially, but it reminded me a lot of like Chuck Wendig's writing, and it was done for like this like dark humorous effect, and it worked. But then we go to Dawn, and he's like kind of boring, and I think another issue I had, and normally I understand that like horror can be offensive, it kind of break boundaries, but the story felt very dated, and one, there was the misogyny, and when it was like the Spy, I was like, okay, I get it, he's supposed to be kind of a douchebag, but then there's this whole thing, and I don't expect like the old leech cult or the Satanist cult, whatever, to be like, oh, they're so progressive and feminist, but there's this whole thing where all of the female characters in this book are evil. There's the wife, and this isn't a spoiler because the back of the book is like, oh, the things his wife has done. And then his daughter-in-law is evil, and what they do is they sacrifice baby. It just feels like a very like, oh, you know, women, they have this maternal instinct, but these women don't, so they're evil. And like the cult is basically, the women's purpose is to pump out babies, and again, I don't expect the cult to be especially progressive, but given just a lot of other language in the book, it just was very jarring to me. And then the ableism, and there was another ism, but I forgot, and it's like there's this character who's evil, and he's called the Dwarf, and he's a dwarf, and there's like this emphasis on how, oh, he's so deformed and ugly, and again, when I say it feels dated, it's like, you know, this disabled person, eventually he's not just a disabled person, he's like a, you know, this eldritch entity, but it's like, you know, because he's disabled and he's deformed, he's therefore scary, and again, it's like one of those things people like used to think were weird and creepy, but it was rooted in this kind of prejudice, and it just felt like, it makes it feel goofy, because I'm like, oh, this guy, he's deformed and he's a dwarf. I'm like, that's not creeping me out. It's just like, it's kind of silly because I don't think of someone with dwarfism as particularly scary. So yeah, I really struggled to get into the Croning, but overall, especially with what I read and some of the amazing imagery, I'm definitely open to giving Laird Barron another try. So anyway, those are all my October reads. What would you recommend? What are your favorite scary books, etc.? I hope I wasn't too awkward. Again, I'm still getting used to this whole being in front of the camera thing. And anyway, me and Norman hope you have a wonderful weekend and a wonderful Halloween.